Welcome back to the Everything History podcast for another installment on the French Revolution. This is episode 13, the Dechristianization of France. And make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the Everything History podcast if you haven't already. And we're going to cover a lot today, so be prepared.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
In the previous episode, we had just finished up the Women's March in the most eventful portion of the October days of 1789. Moreover, the Women's March ended in an eventful fashion, to say the least. Through intimidation and the careful negotiations of Marquis de Lafayette, the king had ratified both the August Decrees and the Declaration of Rights of Man. Yet that same night, rioters conspired to murder the royal family. The attack was repulsed, but in the end, King Louis was prompted to permanently move from Versailles to Paris. Thus we ended as the House of Bourbon proceeded to Paris surrounded by 60,000 of their own people. Picking up the story from there, what do we make of all that? Particularly that quote-unquote procession to Paris. Was it really a procession, or was it more of an armed escort of royal prisoners? Well, let's be real. It was a procession by force. A witness, the Bishop Talleyrand, who I will introduce later on, said the royals were, quote, carried as prisoners to Paris amidst the mangled bodies and heads of their most faithful servants, end quote. With that in mind, I assert that King Louis truly had no other option. What was he going to do? Say no? When his royal palace is surrounded by tens of thousands of people that are tempted to murder him and his family if he says no? So, yes, the citizens asked the king to move to Paris, but the asking was just a formality. They were going to make it happen no matter what. Whatever the case, the monarchy of France was now completely and totally subject to the will of the people, and, quote, Versailles was left a museum as they left. Those were the apt words of the historian Simon Schama. And soon after, in late October, Louis's own monarchical title was changed. No longer was he King of France, he was now Louis XVI, King of the French. The National Assembly also stripped the monarchy of the majority of his leftover powers, but they did leave him a lesser version of the suspension veto power. In other words, the king's place in government had been hemmed into a small corner where all the delegates of the assembly hoped he would stay quiet. With this matter firmly settled and the revolutionary fever again burned out, the National Constituent Assembly got back to molding a new French government. So right now we're going to plow through the National Assembly's governmental reforms because they lay the groundwork or the foundation for the rest of our story. And it's quite frankly easier to get it all out of the way up front so we can get back to the juicy bits of our story. Everything they set out to do was intended to be a step towards a constitution, but it would not be entirely complete, the constitution I mean, until 1791. So the assembly set about creating their new nation in piecemeal fashion. And in late autumn of 1789, they were trying to create a working bureaucracy. You see, the National Assembly had quite a lot of power and authority in and around Paris, especially because of the National Guard's presence, but their authority waned quite a bit the further from Paris one got. There was very little local government functioning in the provinces, and the only regions of official control were the main roads where soldiers were stationed to maintain order. The National Assembly sought to rectify this by creating a new local government structure. They did away with the old regime's method of local control, mainly because the Great Fear had destroyed the previous local governments anyhow. So they decided to divide France into 83 departments. On a map to Americans, these departments would look like state counties. These departments were divided into smaller designations and to be run by local elected councils and officials. These elections for local officials were months away, though, set for the summer of 1790. All local citizen militias were also now proclaimed to be under the command and authority of the National Guard. The National Assembly hoped such reforms would provide stability in France, but the results of their efforts would not be revealed until deep into 1790. And another issue the delegates sought to reform was the legislative process itself. The delegates, under pressure from the citizens, were very much aware that they had only been elected to their current positions because of the Estates General. And people were beginning to ask how long they intended to stay in office, and more importantly, when the next elections for the National Assembly would be. So the Assembly sought to lay down the ground rules for electing France's representatives to the National Assembly. Primarily, they needed to decide how long of terms delegates were elected to, who was allowed to vote, and when the next elections were to be set. For a few weeks off and on in between a lot of other constitutional legislation, they deliberated and proposed many methods of constructing France's election system, and eventually the Assembly came to a majority decision. The succeeding generations of the National Constituent Assembly were to be called legislative assemblies. These legislative assemblies were to contain 745 seats and sit for 2 years. The election process, though, was far more interesting and not for good reasons. I would almost call their design system sinister. I say sinister because the Assembly chose to discreetly abandon the Enlightenment ideals that had drove the July Revolution that had given them power in the first place. If they had stayed close to their principles and ideals, far more French citizens would have been given the vote. The only citizens allowed to vote in these elections were quote-unquote active citizens. Active citizens were defined as men, and only men, over the age of 25 that paid their taxes. That meant only 4.3 million, about 15% of the population, were given the vote. I will say, though, that during this point in early modern history, that was quite a democratic experiment. Or was it? For the election system was actually more complex than just that, and not for the good of the common people. Allow me to explain. These active citizens, as they were called, did not vote directly for their legislative representatives, but instead voted for electors. And to be an elector, one had to be paying an even higher amount of taxes. Very few electors were to be chosen. In fact, the number was only around 45,000. And it was these select few electors that actually voted for the legislative delegates. And to be a delegate, one had to meet all the previous requirements and be paying a still higher tax rate. So, after doing some arithmetic, that means that literally only 0.15% of the French population was actually voting for the representatives. That sounds an awful lot like aristocracy to me, and the National Assembly tried to hide this in complicated legislation, but many newspapers, journals, and pamphlets still caught the scent of privilege. For example, in his journal entitled The Revolutions in France and in Brabant, Camille Desmoulins critiqued the legislation by saying, quote, "It has turned France into an aristocratic government. What is this much-repeated word active citizen supposed to mean? The active citizens are the ones who took the Bastille." End quote. That being said, the Assembly's new legislation was a great leap forward for liberty in France. For the active citizens did vote on much more than just electors and their legislative representatives. They were to be the ones voting for local officials, judges, and even their priests. And all these elections were set for July of 1790. So, after all this local government business and election legislation was pushed through and settled, the National Assembly was again forced to acknowledge the elephant in the room, the financial crisis. Indeed, despite the fanfare of the momentous revolution and all that had changed, the debt of France was still a looming thundercloud over the entire French world. The financial minister Jacques Necker, who has popped up in our story many times, reported the need for another 80 million livres loan to keep the country afloat. He also proposed a series of temporary taxes, but by this time it had become clear that Necker's popularity was fleeting, and his news was, as you might imagine, unwelcomed amongst the delegates. The Assembly's response I actually find quite funny because it reminds me of the U.S. Congress during recent years. It seems like every year Congress has actually been considering defaulting on national debt and or loans, or just letting the government go into shutdown by refusing to do anything fiscally responsible. And the National Assembly had the same type of discussion when faced again with the overwhelming financial burden. A few delegates, actually quite a lot, plucked up the courage to actually propose saying, what if we just allow ourselves to go into bankruptcy? What's the worst that could happen? And that is much of the same rhetoric that the U.S. House of Representatives likes to toy with today. And naturally, the Assembly erupted into great debate over this issue. Should they continue to limp along with another loan or simply take the deep plunge into financial bankruptcy? But there was another very large financial constraint occurring in France. People were refusing to pay taxes and dues. And if this continued for much longer, financial anarchy was inevitable. Yes, ever since the outbreak of the Great Fear in late July, the people had largely begun to refuse to pay into the tax system, especially in the provinces. And why would they? There really was no provincial government to speak of. The peasants began to see taxes as entirely wasteful, like throwing their coin into a pit. This is also another primary reason the Assembly wanted to reinstitute local bureaucracy and governance. So in October and November, when the National Assembly was trying to scrape together tax money, they found that it had become habitual in the provinces to shirk off tax payments. All over the country, people had destroyed toll gates, clerk offices, and persecuted tax collectors, which consequently reinforces and perpetuates my personal belief that being a tax collector in the 18th century was one of the all-time worst occupations. Anyways, let me provide some examples. In the province of Picardy, tax evasion was so bad that receipts reported a drop of 80% in tax revenue. Furthermore, indirect taxation nationwide dropped by over 50% as 1789 came to a close. And these tax evasion issues would continue to plague France as the Revolution period continued into the 1790s. And now that we've made our way through some of the Assembly's complicated constitution building, we can get back to our story. And in our tale, we are still in the fall of 1789, specifically mid-October, as the Assembly debated what to do about the impending bankruptcy. Comte de Mirabeau proved to be the loudest voice in the early stages of the debate. He said, quote, "I don't see that bankruptcy would be such a great evil. Bankruptcy would only fall on the big capitalists of Paris and other towns who are ruining the state." End quote. And in the early stages of the talks, it seemed that this point of view was actually quite popular. The delegates seemed willing to let the economy crash. But this prevailing opinion may have simply been a smear campaign against the financial minister, Jacques Necker. I find it safe to say that the delegates, led by the always bombastic Mirabeau, were grandstanding on the issue of finances. This is the case because Necker had proposed a series of new taxes, and the delegates wanted to appear to be taking a hard line and oppose the taxation. This is a frequently used political tactic that is prevalent to this day. And this grandstanding becomes even more evident when a few weeks later, Comte de Mirabeau made his true politics clear when he apparently changed his mind and flip-flopped on the bankruptcy issue. Mirabeau now led the fight against bankruptcy, saying, quote, "What is bankruptcy if not the most cruel, the most unequal, and the most disastrous of all taxes?" End quote. And Mirabeau continued his orations in a most belligerent manner, verbally attacking his constituents for being so quote-unquote naive on the danger of bankruptcy, completely ignoring his previous stance on the issue, but whatever, that's politics. Mirabeau even promoted what I'd like to call selective punishment, meaning that he pushed for legislation to seize money and land from a certain class of people for the greater good of the masses. Robespierre, who will gain infamy later, recorded Mirabeau's words. He said, quote, "For surely it is necessary that a small number perish so that the mass of people may be saved. Strike, destroy without pity these sorry victims, hurl them into the abyss." End quote. And Mirabeau said that any man who balked from such a national need were, quote, "inconsequential men, pusillanimous men," and he warned them to do away with their honor, saying, quote, "Are you so sure that so many men without bread will leave you in peace to savor the dishes of which you have reduced neither the number nor the delicacy? No, you will perish, and in the universal conflagration, the loss of your quote-unquote honor will not save even one of your detestable pleasures." End quote. These words were strong, but they left the delegates with still more questions. Many accused Mirabeau of simply pandering to the public, which is undoubtedly true, and many more asked who exactly Mirabeau intended to victimize. After all, he had not specified. So who did the Assembly want to extract money from? Well, a man named Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgueux had an idea. History remembers this man as simply Talleyrand, which I will now Anglicanize and pronounce in English as Talleyrand. Anyways, Talleyrand was a Catholic quote-unquote bishop in France who was a good friend of Mirabeau. And I say bishop in quotes because truthfully, Talleyrand was not a very religious man, and certainly did not support the agenda of the church. In fact, the Pope will later kick him out of the Catholic Church. On October 10th, though, Talleyrand proposed what is to be called the Decree on Church Lands. This bill proposed, essentially, that the funds of the French clergy be nationalized. meaning that the National Assembly was now considering seizing all of the church's funds to be used at their discretion for the sake of the nation. Talleyrand prefaced his proposal by saying, quote, "Great dangers demand equally drastic remedies," end quote. Mirabeau commended his colleague and friend, and another great debate ensued. This was an extremely important decision, for it was to decide the fate and role of the Catholic Church in France from thenceforth. And in the early debate, it became clear that the vote would come down to how much the delegates and the citizen populace disliked the clergy. And it turned out that in 1789, France was rife with anti-clericalism, which I just found out to be a very hard word to say. The debate amongst the Assembly and the masses eventually came to a vote on November 3rd, 1789. The property of the clergy was nationalized by a vote of 568 to 346. This now meant that the land of the clergy was now owned by the state and that the church's treasuries were now seized by the National Assembly. Such a measure brought in hundreds of millions of livres to be used by the new French government, but it also caused, as you might imagine, a whole slew of unintended consequences. The people saw this law as another opportunity to raid churches, abbeys, and publicly harass clergy members in the streets throughout the country. The clerics themselves were severely disappointed and angry at the actions of the new government and the National Assembly in particular. This only got worse in early December when the clergy's lands began to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. One priest, Abbé Montesquieu, described the legislation not as reforms, but as full-scale desecration and demolition of the church. He asked in early 1790 if this new French constitution was, quote, now to be one of those pagan cults that demands human sacrifices, end quote. The leaders of the church in their despondency said that the National Assembly had begun, quote, exterminating angels in France. Let's slow up a bit here, because through the August decrees and the decree on church lands, the First and Second Estates of France had been utterly destroyed. Something I bring up now is how the nobles and clergy reacted to this rapid-fire legislation, which I have yet to really address. I'm referring to their actions, not their words in pamphlets or journals, that sort of thing. Thanks to the chaos of the Great Fear and the annihilation of the church, many nobles and clergy saw the writing on the wall. And they began to emigrate. That's immigrate with an E. In textbooks, journals, pamphlets, and other literature, you will see these folk referred to as emigres, which is just French for immigrants. Beginning in late 1789, many of these noble and clergy classes saw their homes, families, and lives either destroyed or put in jeopardy. And like sensible folk, they wanted to get the heck out of France. And it became such an issue that the National Assembly actually made it illegal to try and quote-unquote abandon their country. Nevertheless, thousands of the First and Second Estates abandoned their lands and titles to seek refuge in neighboring nations. These immigrants, or emigres, would only increase in number, hitting their peak in early 1792, but we'll get to that in due course. It is now January of 1790, and the National Assembly has now dealt in some way or another with local government, their election system, the financial crisis, feudalism, monarchy, and the church. All these legislative and constitutional reforms were well and good, but many of them had yet to be put in practice, specifically the former three. The reforms to local government, the new election system, and the financial reforms had yet to be actually put into action. Local bureaucracy and the elections would have to wait until the summer of 1790, so instead the Assembly set about constructing an economic recovery program. As previously mentioned, they had already begun this process with the nationalization of church property, most notably in December when they began selling national lands in order to fund the government. This quickly raised a few hundred million livres, but it was a slow process because the land had to be assessed before it could be sold, and it was made even slower when you consider the fact that many clergy and peasants were still living on that land. To go along with these sales, the National Assembly decided in late December and early January to issue a paper bond called assignats. These assignats were printed at a set value. A common value of an assignat was 400 livres. The National Assembly printed these bonds because there was not enough money in circulation to actually rapidly pay off loans, debts, interest, and maintain a functioning economy at the same time. So the plan was to use these high-valued bonds to pay off international payments while keeping the actual coinage functioning back in France. The assignats were meant to be a one-time paper currency. This may seem pretty dull talking about French currency and everything, but I assure you it is of the utmost importance, and I wouldn't be talking about it if it was not pertinent. And it is pertinent because before the assignat, France had yet to use paper currency. Well, back in the 1720s they had actually tried, but it had failed miserably, so they switched back to coinage. There's nothing wrong with using paper currency. Obviously our modern economies use paper money, but it is incredibly difficult to manage if it is the first time a country begins to rely on paper money. Why, you ask? Well, with coins you have confidence in its value because it is actually inherently valuable. It's made of gold, silver, copper, or whatever, and it is issued at a set weight. And unless the government suddenly floods the market with a certain metal, then its value will remain quite stable. Paper is an entirely different matter. The only reason paper money is valued at all is because everyone believes it has value. This value usually comes from the fact that there is some sort of metal currency to back it up, like gold or silver. And if you have confidence and surety that you can go down to the shop and buy bread or whatever with your paper bill, then the paper has monetary value. But here's the rub. If paper currency is not properly regulated, it can be easily overproduced. It is far, far easier to flood the market with paper currency than it is with metal-based currency. Thus, it is very hard for a nation first introducing paper money, in this case the assignat, to properly regulate it because it requires a solid banking system, a strong government, and financial ministers and secretaries that know what they're doing. France's financial minister Jacques Necker very much knew what he was doing, but France's banking system was in over its head and its government was beyond unstable. So it wasn't exactly a good time to introduce paper money, and Necker advised just that in 1790. He warned the National Assembly that paper currency would only exacerbate the financial problems if it got out of control, but the delegation insisted that the assignat notes were to be only national bonds, not actual currency. And with that in mind, the paper assignat began to be printed, and it was actually quite effective during the first few months of 1790. However, the National Assembly failed to heed Necker's advice and began to print far too much paper money until the assignat became no longer a bond but legal tender itself. And by 1791-92, the introduction of the assignat and its poor implementation would cause massive inflation across France. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For as the assignats began to be printed in January, the National Assembly turned its attention to other affairs as they awaited the summer elections. Most notably, they were still very much dealing with the fallout from their nationalization of the church. A French bishop in late 1789 said, quote, "I cannot renounce my spiritual contract which binds me to my church. I belong to my flock in life and in death. If God wishes to test his own, the 18th century, like the 1st century, will have its martyrs." End quote. But the National Assembly did not back off. On February 13th, they dissolved all monasteries and convents. This, coupled with the previous nationalization decree, essentially left priests, monks, and nuns without homes or incomes. To continue holding a religious office, the priests would have to wait for the local elections, and once elected, all priests were to be under the payroll of the National Constituent Assembly and the nation of France. This also created a rise in tension between Protestants and Catholics, as Protestants were left largely unscathed despite the heavy-handed legislation directed towards the Catholic Church. All of this greatly disturbed many Catholics, and many appealed directly to the Pope. It seemed that France was rapidly Dechristianizing, and the thought of church officials being paid by the government disturbed more than just Christians. Many citizens across France protested the decision because of the fear that the government could begin using priests to manipulate the masses. The National Assembly and its leaders countered this by reminding citizens that the active citizens among them would be electing all of their parish priests. So if they suspected corruption, it was their responsibility as voters to use democracy to elect a new priest. The Pope, though, was not so easily put at ease. During this time, the papacy was held by Pius VI, and during early 1790, Pius remained silent on the issue, waiting for a correct moment to intervene. Many across Europe feared another great schism in the Roman Church if the issue in France got too out of hand. To deal with the outstanding clergy members in France, the National Assembly demanded that all priests, bishops, and clergy members in France swear an oath under God to be faithful to the people, the king, the National Assembly, and the new French nation. And they also said that all clerics that refused were to be removed from office and replaced immediately. These oaths were to take place periodically throughout early 1790, beginning with the clerical delegates of the National Assembly itself. But from the beginning, this oath-swearing scheme failed miserably because it forced religious men to essentially choose between God or France. And only a fraction of the clergy delegates in the National Assembly itself took the oath, and hundreds of clerics across the nation followed their example. Immediately after, though, the clerics were met with death threats from crowds outside even the National Assembly. Throngs of people on January 4th demanded the lynching of all clerics that refused to take the oath. It was then that Pope Pius VI intervened. In March and later April of 1790, the Pope formally requested that the clerics of the Roman Church refuse the oath. The National Assembly was humiliated and the anti-clerical citizens were incensed at the clergy's lack of national loyalty. Images of the Pope and Christ were burned in Paris and throughout the provinces. Christian crosses were burned in city squares. There was now an official schism between the Roman Church and France, and the Pope began to quietly recommend that his French constituents leave France for their own safety. That just about brings us up to May of 1790. But we've reached the end of our rope for this episode. Before I sign off, though, let's talk of other countries' reactions to the ongoing turmoil in France. I'll focus just right now on the English and American perspectives, but I assure you the Spanish, Dutch, and Austrians were more than simply nervous about the events in France. In the still developing United States, the general population greatly supported the French Revolution, but the government itself was divided on the issue. This divide is best exemplified by Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson had just left France and strongly supported the French cause, but Hamilton had a very different view. Hamilton described the revolution as a, quote, disgusting spectacle and a, quote, terrible sight which betrayed a plan to disorganize the human mind as well as to undermine the venerable pillars of civilized society, end quote. President George Washington, for his part, led America on a neutral course, neither condemning nor praising the situation in France. In England, the opinions of the populace were muddled, with most people's opinions being based on sparse information. The parliamentary leader and famous orator Edmund Burke, though, wrote a series of letters commenting on the revolution in France. Edmund Burke held a conservative view and noted that France was experiencing a dichotomy. Burke said, quote, all circumstances taken together, the French Revolution is the most astonishing that has hitherto happened in the world. But these most wonderful things are brought about in many instances by means of the most absurd and ridiculous. Everything seems out of nature in this strange chaos of levity and ferocity, end quote. And Edmund Burke warned that this strange chaos was occurring far too quickly in France. He warned that if the revolutionary process did not slow in France, then it would end up in a, quote, horrible and disgustful situation, end quote. And it was these views that led the American and English governments to pursue a relatively neutral course of action in dealing with the early stages of the French Revolution. Alright, we bit off a lot of information in this episode, and when the Everything History podcast continues, France will experience more constitution building, their summer elections, and the abolition of their nobility.
Thank you very much.